Hi everybody, welcome to the States of Change Learning Festival and what promises to be a fascinating discussion on how governments think and how they could think better. My name's Hannah-Rankin, and before I start I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting on. Here in Victoria, I'm in St Kilda, home of the Yalukut Weelam clan of the Boon Wurrung, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging of the first people of all these lands, wherever we are across the world. It's an extraordinary opportunity that we have here to come together at such a critical time and create the space for us all to listen, connect, and learn. Everyone here knows that governments and the various systems within which they work are complex beasts. And this COVID crisis has forced all governments to work differently, build different relationships, find new patterns, build society-wide interventions, and most strikingly, they've had to do all of this at speed, which is not a traditional strength of bureaucracies. Governments that have traditionally struggled with data and technology and public engagement are suddenly reliant on all of these things to navigate through a pandemic, while also maintaining public trust. And we're seeing an extraordinary diversity of approaches: herd immunity, states of emergency, border closures, quarantines, Lysol, some of which are working well, others less so. And we're increasingly learning from each other as we go. So what could the lessons we're learning mean for the future of government? Are we in the midst of a revolution in how governments think? And if so, what does this mean for how we think about ourselves, our roles, our skills and methods? These are complex questions requiring a balance of expertise, creativity and wisdom. And we've got two extraordinary speakers to help us work through this topic this evening. Maniam is a formidably experienced public servant in the Singapore Ministry of Communications and Information. His international experience includes everything from traditional policy areas like economics through to strategic futures, innovation, and serious play. And materially for this discussion, which we'll need to draw on both sides of our brains, Aaron is also an internationally recognized poet. So providing in-person proof that bureaucracy and creativity can coexist. You heard it here. And then we have Geoff Mulgan, who's working in collective intelligence, public policy, and social innovation at University College London. It's actually quite difficult to do an introduction on Geoff. I'll take as read his role as one of the leading international thinkers and practitioners in public sector innovation. Instead, I wanted to highlight a couple of earlier aspects of his career that help explain his talent in bringing original perspectives to bear, working across disciplines. Geoff has both a doctorate in telecommunications and is also a trained Buddhist monk. So tonight we're going to hear first from Geoff, looking at government as a collective intelligence and picking apart how it thinks and how it should think better. Then Aaron is going to talk about what this looks like in Singapore and the questions that it's raising. Finally, we'll have some question time for everyone, so please start putting your questions in now. You'll see a special Q&A function down the bottom of your screen. And remember that you can push questions up the list by voting for them with a thumbs up. So without further ado, over to you, Geoff. Thanks.
Well, good morning, evening, whatever it may be. I hope you can see me now. And it's really good to be with all of you, and in particular with Sao and Aaron, who I've admired for many years. They don't only have extraordinary track records, they also, I think, are fairly unique in both having 4 A's in their names, which must be a sign of how amazing they are, as to be become first in everything. Anyway, I'm going to share some thoughts about government as a brain, and I'm going to use pictures to save you from having to look at my face for too much, if this actually is going to work. Here we go. And talk a little bit about how we use the crisis to bounce back and some of the possibilities of where government might be going. And I will argue that, in fact, we are on the cusp of some quite radical changes in the ways in which government should be organized, could be organized, and this crisis has accelerated some of them. Now, it's kind of fairly obvious this has been an extraordinary moment of very big government as the Leviathan, the organization we turn to when things go wrong. And all over the world, we've seen these huge schemes of income support and business support, imposing unprecedented rules, and also extraordinary creativity all over the world. I've just put in a few examples from Rwanda, India, Vietnam, Austria, maybe we can come to. A very fascinating geography of creativity. We are seeing sort of new normals in terms of government intervention in the economy, and beginning to think through second and third order effects, like accelerating automation, I think being caused by some of the social distancing rules. What I'm really going to focus on, though, is how we make sure this is a crisis which is useful. And you can say that any crisis is either, in a sense, homeostatic, that's to say, its main purpose of the interventions is to get back to where you were before. That's what happens if you have a sickness, you want to return to when you were well, or whether this is one of those crises which truly is transformative. And I think many people now feel the financial crisis, which was the last great crisis of our times, should have been a transformative one, but instead was just a homeostatic one. And so we failed to use that opportunity to deal with all sorts of underlying issues, from climate change to inequality and so on. So my interest is really in how can government think better? How can it mobilize all the potential resources of intelligence within the public service, but also within the wider society? And I think there are some really big choices to be made there. There is kind of one version of government as a brain, which is it all depends on the intuitions of the leader's brain. And whatever he happens to think or tweet at 5 a.m. in the morning is wisdom. And that is still how many governments are run, but it's not necessarily a brilliant way to do things. There's another version of government as a brain, which we've seen many times in the past and are seeing a little bit through this crisis, which is coercive intelligence of a state trying to find out about what everyone is doing. And some countries like Hungary, have used this crisis to strengthen the coercive powers of the state over society. What I want to talk about, though, is really a vision of government as shared intelligence with the people, with society, with the economy. And what that means for how we share all of these different things you can see there, which I argued in the past are the elements which together constitute an intelligence, an ability to observe, to have models of the world, to predict, to remember, to coordinate, to empathize, to create, and ultimately to have judgment and wisdom which reflects the best of the society. And that for me is the challenge and the promise of this crisis is, can we come closer to a vision of really a government thinking with people using all of these different things. Now we start often with a picture of government as a control room. This is a picture of the COBRA committee, which is where the UK government sort of goes for emergencies, and had quite a nice TV series on it recently. In fact, what I'm going to argue is that gives you sometimes quite a misleading view of government as a brain. The idea there is a kind of control room which pulls all the levers and sees everything. There's elements of truth in that. But in fact, what's really interesting about recent neuroscience is it tells us that actually brains, your own brains at this very moment, don't quite work like that. You don't have a little sort of control room deep inside there which analyzes everything. They're much better understood as sometimes competing and cooperating modules which together generate either wisdom or folly, but as an emergent property rather than in a very pure hierarchical way. And so some of those elements come from observation, the sort of things you see in the screens at the back of the room. Some come from models. And I think this has been a really interesting crisis, probably more than I've ever seen before, where explicitly governments have had to use models and competing models to make sense of the world. This is just a picture of one of the models which had the biggest influence here in the UK, which appeared to show about 2 months ago that unless there was a complete change of direction away from herd immunity, we would see huge numbers of deaths and our health service collapse. Now, what's been interesting is many people have critiqued this model. It's got all sorts of flaws and bugs and so on, but it's in a way a society being explicit about modeling as a, again, an emergent, competitive, interrogative process. And we've always had that a little bit with economic models. I think we'll see much more of this in the future. We've also seen all sorts of clever ways of using data. So this is a screenshot from this week from Seoul. I do quite a bit of work there with the the mayor and his team, and they've Korea in a way has done really well in gathering all sorts of kinds of data from mobile phone records, credit cards and so on, to track everyone who's been infected, who they've been in contact with, and to get a grip on the crisis, including, you know, not long ago when they found a guy had been around Seoul's nightclubs infecting huge numbers of people in one go. But the result, as you can see there, is Seoul, a city of 11 million people, has still only had about 4 deaths. So smart data orchestration by a government can be incredibly effective. We'll hear, I'm sure, a bit from Aaron about Singapore, which also, in some ways, had a very different approach, but using the Trace Together app and human contact tracing teams, you know, was very quick and very efficient in getting to grips again with the patterns of infection, far ahead of most European or any of the North American governments, using, again, a mix of machine technology, data, and human groups to understand what was happening in real time. And probably Taiwan has gone even further, again, pooling together lots of different kinds of data and running these things like digital fences to manage quarantine in an automated way, but being ultra transparent about how it is doing it. So it is government as a brain, government in some ways being very coercive, but doing it in a way which is very visibly shared with society rather than done in a secretive way. And then I think a little bit of a step ahead perhaps of some other countries. China, working with Alibaba and Tencent and others, have put in place a whole array of systems to try and, you know, track people who've been infected, and with this sort of green, yellow, red system, giving people different rights to travel. And my guess is we will have things very like that in Europe this summer and autumn, trying to cope with a population where some people will already have, you know, immunity proven by antibody tests, others won't have been infected at all, others will be at high risk. And again, this is a very different kind of intelligence orchestration needed for government, mixing data, machine intelligence, but also a lot of human ingenuity as well. And all of this will be needed until we have a vaccine. And some of this is being pulled together very explicitly in some countries. This is a picture from Bangladesh, where they've made it very explicitly a collective intelligence system for COVID, linking together a whole variety of data sources from self-assessment, from health workers, trying to analyze it and risk assess and triage, and bringing together corporates like the mobile phone companies, big NGOs, and feeding that all into the process of decision making. And they're a country with a fantastic team in their government, really thinking about government as a brain in ways which I think are well ahead of what I've seen in my own country at the moment. So these are all sort of different ways of thinking about intelligence. I wrote about them a little bit a couple of years ago in my book, Big Mind, how you might create what I call intelligence assemblies, which combine observations and data, models, analysis, creativity, memory of what had been done in the past. And for me, what's exciting about COVID is seeing governments doing this at speed, at scale, in a way where even a couple of years ago, I found many governments didn't really understand what I was talking about. But this crisis has forced attention to that, and the beginnings of a conversation about how you might apply similar tools to an issue like climate change. There are a few other angles to this also, which I think are exciting for the future. So one is how governments collaborate with society, where you have collective intelligence with the community as well. So on the right-hand side of the screen is a project which I was involved in setting up called Good Sam, which is a platform which has been used here for about 750,000 people to volunteer to help the health service. And that's a way of combining public effort and state power to better deal with the crisis. And there are many others. On the left, there's ways of organizing circles of support around isolated older people, or the one at the top from Brooklyn, which I quite like, where they've combined many elements to manage food supplies. But these are new, almost kind of bricolage, hybrid tools, combining the state with society to mobilize resources of commitment and intelligence and care to solve a problem. And there have also been many in science, a whole array of collective intelligence projects mobilizing thousands of people to speed up the design of antiviral proteins through FOLLY, or the design of new equipment, or in many countries working with the UN on the design of protective equipment of all kinds. So again, collective intelligence, I feel in the last few months has advanced what might have otherwise taken a decade or so. And that's all quite exciting. So I just want to mention the challenges for government, and then one big issue before then turning over for comment and conversation. So I think one thing this crisis is confirming is the need for both new skills and new rules in government. So in relation to the skills, it's really striking through this crisis something which has probably always been the case, that any government has to juggle, if you like, a whole series of different kinds of knowledge. And I've listed a few of them there: policy knowledge, scientific knowledge, professional knowledge, knowledge of public opinion, practitioner views, political knowledge. You have to juggle all of these things, and none trumps any others. This is why you can't say you're following the science, because the science has to be weighed up a lot against lots of other kinds of knowledge. And I think it's increasingly clear we need political leaders and civil service leaders who are at ease with these different kinds of knowledges, understand them, and know how to integrate them into action. Too often we have leaders who come from backgrounds either in law or journalism, which aren't very well suited for dealing with systemic challenges like a pandemic or climate change or financial crashes. So I think, and this is one of the reasons why States of Change is such an important initiative, we really need to think about the curriculum, the skill set, and the mindsets needed for future government. And many governments have fallen short because they haven't attended to this in the right ways recently. And then we also need new rules. So one of the, in a sense, the risks of everything I've described, of governments gathering lots more data about what everyone is doing, is of course, it takes you to the risk of a big brother society. And many people don't trust governments to be tracking their every move, or who they were in a nightclub with, or in an Uber. And I've thought for quite a while, we are now overdue a new set of institutions around governance of data. We have all of these different kinds of data. I won't go through this chart in detail. It's one we did about a year ago, looking at all the different kinds of data where you can't avoid sharing it, some of which is very private, some of which is very public. But what's clear to me at the moment, most countries do not have trusted guardians of their data, which can do the linking, which is so valuable for shared intelligence, but in ways which the public trusts not to be abused, not to be sold on, not to be given to the security forces without a good reason. And so my hope is, again, we will accelerate move to the creation of new kinds of data trust and guardians, which allow us to get the benefits of shared intelligence and data, but without the risks. And at the moment, say, there's no country in the world quite doing that, but I can't see how we get to the upside of government as a brain without some governance innovation around data. And then finally, just a couple of minutes on one other aspect of government as a brain, which is how to think, or how to imagine. I quite like this quote from Milton Friedman, the neoliberal economist, who said, "Only a crisis produces real change, and when it occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around." And he saw his job as being to create lots of those ideas, those alternatives, keeping them alive until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And I've been sort of worried for quite a while that we've been missing some of that kind of work, some of that work on the true sort of needed social imagination for the future. And if you're interested, a few weeks ago, Demos Helsinki and UCL published this paper looking at the crisis of imagination, why this ability to imagine had declined, why technological imagination has sort of squeezed it out. So we could imagine smart cities or future AI, but not the future of childcare or democracy, and how many people found it much easier to imagine apocalypses, things getting much worse than things getting better. And this made various proposals for how to fix that. And actually see things like universal basic income, which has moved quite a lot in the last few weeks, almost as part of the problem, not the answer, because it's an interesting idea. It's one of many ways of thinking about future welfare. I personally think it's not all that convincing as an adequate answer to the complexity of welfare needs, but the fact that people jump on it as the answer shows us how thin, how desiccated our shared social imagination has been. And so I become interested in all these different sources of imagination in the past, from fiction and poetry, which Aaron does, to fully formed utopias, to places like eco-towns, or in the past, which try to prefigure the future society. And I think we need, in the next few years, much more energetic, almost revival of these traditions, these methods, these skills of imagining what a better society could look like. And government cannot function as a brain unless it's fed by this kind of imagination. And it then gives us a kind of space to play with, a space which has, all these different domains of government action, like elder care, or data, or health, or new social contracts, or how we deal with wildlife and tax, and all sorts of new methods which kind of cut across multiple domains, like new ways of thinking about circular economies, or deconstructing property rights into stacks, something I was talking to the Japanese government about just yesterday, or what could be other versions of Chinese social credit systems which could be useful. We need a much richer, much more systematic, much more visionary social imagination to help government function as a brain. So I hope that gives a flavor of the case, if you like, of why we may be beginning to see a very different way of organizing the state, mobilizing intelligence of all kinds, from observations to models to memory to creativity, ideally with society rather than imposed on society. But getting there will require a leap in imagination, and probably too a leap in skills and mindsets as well. And the people on this call, of course, are fantastically well placed to contribute to that. Sam, back to you.
Oh, whoops. I'm sorry, I can't start my video because can people still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Aaron, thank you very much, Geoff. That was a fascinating kind of overview. And look, we're going to seamlessly transition across to Aaron just to talk us through Singapore's perspective on this. My brother actually lives in Singapore, and it's been fascinating. In Australia, we've had a very linear kind of response to this emergency. We've been able to see what's happening elsewhere and respond in a very orderly way. Singapore has been so flexible and responsive in terms of changing parameters of how things work, and really interested to see how this much more flexible and responsive approach has worked from your perspective. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you to the whole States of Change team for this very kind invite. It's always a bit hard to follow Geoff, but I will do my best. And I wanted to really build on what he said, because, Geoff, you started by basically telling us that you are treating government as a brain, right? And what I love about that is that it's a metaphor for understanding what government is and does. And Sam, you mentioned how important poetry is in my life. And I'm finding actually that the link between public policy and poetry is hugely important and much more understated than we might have given it credit for in the past. Because actually metaphors are everywhere, right? And we have different metaphors for all the things that we go through and the things that we experience. And understanding that those metaphors, I think, is the key to understanding this issue of how governments think and whether or not they can think better. If we find better metaphors for understanding what our governments do, then we actually find ways into seeing better ways of thinking. And the metaphors then help us to actually perceive the world in new ways by bringing like and unlike comparisons into sharp relief. So let me explain what I mean by that through some illustrative examples, because while I really like Geoff's metaphor of the brain as being one way of looking at government, I think there are other metaphors that we can look at as well. And one of those is the government as a piece of war machinery. That is probably the most dominant metaphor these days when we think about how governments are responding to COVID. Right? We talk about the necessity of mandating safe distancing. We talk about wearing masks, otherwise there are all sorts of collective or civic punishments that are involved. We talk about flattening the curve. We say we want to defeat the virus. And all of those are deeply martial metaphors. They're not wrong. They are very necessary to impose order and bring some semblance of stability to the situations that we face. So we need these war machinery metaphors. But the fact is that war alone is only one way to look at what government does in this current crisis. And there are actually other ways of looking at the current actions that we undertake. And I think when we bring these multiple metaphors together, we actually end up with much richer understandings of what we're going through. So apart from war, another metaphor that we can use is to really think about government as a boat, right? Government as being the steering entity on a boat, on a river or a sea or a journey of some kind. Now, this is really important because actually what a lot of us are going through in terms of our COVID experiences is a journey, right? We don't quite know where we're going. We don't know what the destination looks like, or if that world will be a world that is salubrious for what we used to do. But we know that we're going somewhere, and we know that the new world is likely to be fairly unrecognized. So this kind of seafaring metaphor becomes really important as well, because it leads us to approach COVID, not just with the attitude of defeating it, but actually trying to learn from this experience and saying there is an adventure here and we can get somewhere that is quite interesting. Singapore actually just ended what we call a period of a circuit breaker. Right? So this was our local term for an almost lockdown, but with some amount of movement within it. And we've ended that today, although there'll be a fair amount of encouragement for people to work from home and for students to learn from home in alternate weeks as well. So we're opening that out and slowly feeling our way around. What does this mean when grandparents can see their grandchildren again, but when we're not encouraging very large groups of people to gather, right? That learning process is, I think, very much a river and a journey that we're all on. But even that is not the only metaphor that we can have. Arundhati Roy, the wonderful novelist, actually talks about COVID as a portal. And if COVID is a portal, then government really is the adventurer or the engineer bringing us to that portal, right? And then trying to equip us with the ability to step through that portal in the best possible way. This, I think, is where some of, Geoff, your points about skills become really critical. Because to walk through a portal and feel comfortable in a new world is all about whether we feel skilled and equipped to deal with those changes. And in Singapore, one of the ways we've done that is we've now issued 4 budgets this year, some of which were designed to provide relief to companies and to individuals. But many of the policies there were about preserving jobs through what we call a job support scheme, as well as providing avenues to support training for people, whether that's through traineeships or internships or actually sponsorship of courses that people can undertake. Now, why is the training so critical? Because training is actually what allows us to step through a portal and be equipped to deal with the vicissitudes and challenges of that new time. And I think that the image of the job support, right, this $93 billion that we've spent so far out of the Singaporean reserves, is all about trying to equip us for that new world and this process of walking through into a new space. It's not about defeating an entity in a war. It's not about defeating an enemy. Neither is it about a journey. It's about stepping through into something that is utterly transformative. And that, I think, requires a very different metaphor for how we approach it. You could also think of government as a convener, right? A convener of community and bringing people together. Social fabric becomes really important that way. The collective part of, Geoff, your collective intelligence becomes really critical there too. And there, I think, is where some of the apps that we've tried to introduce in terms of collective contact tracing through Trace Together, and then another app that we've called Safe Entry, right, which is a simple app that requires us to check in and out of buildings in a fairly seamless way because it allows us to pre-record our particulars and move in ways that are actually quite fluid across different geographical locations. Together, Trace Together and Safe Entry are basically saying that we're all in this together and we therefore have a mutual accountability to one another. That means that government as a convener provides the infrastructure within which the community can thrive and function. And of course, one challenge that we face is that Trace Together has not been adopted as much as we would like. So it's only gone to about 20% of the whole population at the moment. And for it to truly work, we probably will need to double that amount at least. But we're in that process of learning in this. And we're trying to, I think, exhort people in the community to be part of that collective endeavor rather than make it mandatory, which then I think reduces some of the agency that people can have in the whole process. So that's 4 metaphors that I've gone through so far, right? War, boats on rivers and journeys, portals, and government as convener of a community. There is one more, and this is my personal favorite. This is government as the steward and custodian of ecology. And I think if we think of COVID as an ecology that we are in, then what we realize is that we're in this trying to learn the life-giving and life-taking qualities that the virus can have. And this means that there can be a vibrancy, just as ecosystems are vibrant and alive and breathing. But what's interesting about ecologies is they can also be quite cruel. Right? There are winners and losers in ecologies. Those of us who remember ecology from school will remember that in a food chain, those at the top of the food chain consume everything below it. And that is a fundamental ecological principle. And if we transpose that into a world of COVID, what we see is a situation where those who are winning are really, really gaining, right? These are the people who have adjusted with digital skills, who have dealt fairly seamlessly with automation and digitization. But there are others who are experiencing the crisis as a deep trauma, who are coming out of it losing in very deep and profound ways, both because they are more at risk of the virus than others, but because they are also at risk of economic precarity and because they have risks of their overall wherewithal actually being rapidly diminished by the crisis situation. And so that sharing of very different risk profiles becomes critical, I think, in an ecological metaphor. And if we see COVID as a garden of some kind and a metaphor, then I think we need to find ways to understand that in a very different way from if we observe government purely as a collective intelligence or as a brain. I also wonder, even within ecologies, there are many types of it, right? You have tropical jungles, you've got English gardens, you've got Japanese bonsai. Those are very different in terms of how manicured and controlled they can be. And I think different countries are approaching COVID in very different ways because their underpinning metaphor has actually changed. Let me end off with a couple of observations just to tie things back even more to Geoff's wonderful presentation, which is that, Geoff, when you talked about different knowledge and different skills becoming critical, I think what underpins that is that actually different metaphors provide the foundational basis for different parts of language and different knowledge. The different things that disciplines do come partly because their underlying metaphors are different. The metaphors of legality versus the metaphors of physics versus the metaphors of history versus the metaphors of engineering, they're all quite different. And that's why we need these metaphors to intersect with each other, because no single metaphor can help us understand exactly what is going on in all of its richness and complexity. Similarly, when we speak of new rules for data governance, I think there again, one of the key reasons there's such a range of different types of data governance out there in the charts that you showed us is because our metaphors for data are fundamentally different at the moment. Some of us think of data as a public good. Some of us think of it as a form of infrastructure. Some of us think about it as a private good. And in each of that, the responses become different. Data as a trust versus data as a commons versus data as a public entity. Those are all very different approaches because the metaphors underpinning them are very, very different. In Singapore, we're trying to approach data from the view of public infrastructure because we know that when you bring data together, there are so many benefits that cannot be accrued if they are left purely to siloed entities by themselves. But what we're also trying to do is manage the personal security and privacy aspect of data, because we don't want the benefits of public infrastructure to weigh out the fact that people should have sovereignty over their health data and various aspects that are deemed private. So I spent a good amount of time talking about the different metaphors that are at work here, because I do think that once we recognize the metaphors that are out there, we can actually have a much richer understanding of what exactly goes on in these different phenomena. And we probably realize that actually metaphors underpin everything that we do. When we say we run a meeting, that's a metaphor. When we say we defeat an argument, that's also a metaphor. And I hope that underlying and understanding our own metaphors will help us to have much more nuanced and sophisticated responses to the COVID crisis and the kinds of issues that we're all going to be dealing with in different societies. So Sam, I'll stop there and hopefully we'll have a very robust conversation after this.
Thank you very much, Aaron. I am pressing buttons rapidly and no doubt here I am. Yay. Look, this is a fascinating discussion, I think. And, the questions of, the collective intelligence and the metaphors are so interesting in terms of the different kind of approaches and thinking and relationships that they open up in terms of opening our mind. And I think the first question that's sort of come up from the audience is one that I also was really interested to ask. That metaphor of war machinery really resonated, and a lot of government is traditionally in the war machinery phase. How do you talk metaphors to a government of war machinery? Geoff, you mentioned how a lot of our leaders are, come from that legal background, or how do you introduce the radical concepts that we're talking about here in terms of opening our minds, in terms of thinking about things more broadly, about inclusiveness into a conservative space? I might throw to you first, Geoff.
Well, thanks. And thanks, Ariel, for a fantastic talk. And I actually totally agree. You can't escape metaphors and analogies. They're how human brains work, and you either have good ones or bad ones. I think many governments automatically reach for the war metaphor. You create a command in a center, the prime minister, president's like a general pulling levers. But then very quickly, that does in practice fall apart. Right? There's some bits of it which make sense in a crisis and where you need centralization and command and control. But quickly you discover, as Aaron said, is more like the sea. You cannot defeat the sea. You just have to learn how to navigate through it. The government itself is not even like a single boat. It's a flotilla of boats, often with quite conflicting interests. The health service, the economic ministry is often with very different views. And then if you're trying to change public psychology and behavior and so on, you can't just order people, at least in most societies, to do things. You have to entract them, you have to persuade them, you have to win them over, you have to create coalitions. And as I said, for me, one of the really the reasons why I quite like the metaphor of the brain is that 20, 30 years ago, we'd have thought the analogy of the brain was a military one, that there was a sort of command in your brain which controlled things. Now the neuroscience tells us the brain is much more like an ecosystem. It is much more full of competing, conflicting impulses and wills and so on. And that's the metaphor I think we want, I hope, to move towards. And certainly in the next phases of the crisis, with very uneven patterns, again, as Aaron said, of winners and losers and vulnerability, etc., governments will have to be very agile and subtle in how they respond, and single top-down commands and controls and so on just won't work very well. It'll be very, very variegated by place, by sector, by workplace, and that requires a much more sophisticated way of governing than in the midst perhaps of a single battle.
Yeah, it's exactly right. Aaron, I'm really interested in how you've managed to bring metaphors into the bureaucratic environment. I'm using that as a metaphor actually, and now this is when I go through the metaphor, simile, metaphor. Anyway, how have you found trying to bring this kind of thinking and more creative approach into a bureaucracy in your context? Oh, sorry, you're still on mute.
That's a powerful question in a lot of ways, and I agree very much with all the things Geoff said. In terms of how we translate this into the decision makers' vocabulary, one thing I found is just arguing about metaphors is not enough. You can't just tell someone the war metaphor is wrong, you must adopt a brain metaphor, or you must adopt an ecology metaphor. What's necessary, I find, is that people need to experience this. It has to be a visceral experience, not just a rational cognitive one. And what that means is a few things. I mean, in the midst of a crisis, sometimes what that means is having folks walk the ground and just go out there and see what exactly is going on. Now, this is difficult in a situation where safe distancing is prioritized, but it can be done, right? And it can be done by making sure that people are talking to others, by having Zoom chats with different members of society or with journalists who are seeing different things. And I think we find that our politicians and senior officials are open when they hear these different sets of input to actually feel that their initial metaphors may actually have been not wrong, but incomplete. And I think that's probably quite key. What's also important is to not wait till the crisis happens before we start rehearsing these alternative ways of thinking. And in Singapore, we've been working on strategic foresight for a long time. Since the late 1980s, we've had many conversations with Geoff and other folks in Nesta about these conversations. And the whole idea is to bombard ourselves with new ways of thinking in peacetime, so that when there is a non-peacetime situation, and there you see the war metaphor creeping in again, right? Then you actually have some of this rehearsed already. So looking at alternative futures and scenarios has been very powerful. You also mentioned serious games when you introduced me earlier, and I do think those are quite powerful. Going through a crisis that is part of a simulation whether it's a public health crisis or a simulated terrorist attack, those are often ways where we can stress test our mental models quite significantly and come out understanding either their incompleteness or where they need to be complemented by others. So we do find that outside of crisis, doing things like strategic foresight and anticipation, as well as serious games, at the whole of government level, where we talk through how we would respond to different situations, either in a tabletop exercise or a full simulation. Those are very powerful ways of slowly molding the mindsets and making sure that as many of us have a collective understanding that is metaphor rich rather than singular in its approach.
Could I just make one addition to that and link to Brenton's comment and Tyson's comment yesterday about the mind in the gut? So one thing, we were very influenced by Singapore 15, 20 years ago, was exactly how you took senior decision makers through simulations of crises and problems, partly so that at a cognitive level, you would see the gaps in your policies and your programs. But I always interpreted being as much about emotionally understanding how it would feel to be in that situation, and was in a sense training the embodied response as well as the brain response to a crisis. And we did that quite well for a time in the UK, but in the last 5 or 10 years, those simulations have largely stopped, and they've stopped involving the ministers and the top decision makers. And that's one of the reasons why I'm afraid my country didn't respond well to COVID, because it had lost that those habits of, as I say, both brain, gut, heart, whatever you want to call it, learning in parallel what a true crisis feels like. And that also helps you to the better metaphors.
Yeah. Could I just jump in very quickly? There's a story to tell about embodied responses. One of my previous jobs was in our civil service college, where we actually started and what we called an applied simulation training laboratory. Essentially, it was a gaming lab, but if you call something a gaming lab, you're not as likely to get funding than if you call it an applied simulation training laboratory. So we called it that lab. And in the games that we ran, what we saw was exactly what Geoff described. At the end of a day of simulation, which was meant to mirror, say, a 3-week period, we literally had people sitting down in a couch, sinking into it and saying, I am so tired. And then you ask them why, and they say, well, because my whole self was involved in this, right? I had to emote with people, I had to argue with them, I had to understand and empathize. And then we all laughed and said, yeah, when you think about it, right? You didn't have to drive across the country to attend meetings. You didn't have to meet stakeholders in their own environments. You did this all in the confines of a simple space, but just that engendering of multiple roles was already enough to kind of call forth this deeply embodied response. And I think the more we can do that, the better. It's time consuming and it's deeply labor intensive, but I do think these serious games and more broadly serious play approaches have a lot to offer in terms of how to help prepare us for crises.
I think that's a fascinating insight, and it's very much in line with a lot of the thinking at the moment around how it is actually learning through practice that makes people change. And I think, one of those interesting things is the opportunity of crisis when you're bringing people together in those very stressful and vulnerable situations, and how that does create a level of networks and relationships as well that can be perpetuated outside of the particular lab. I'm going to have to get you to actually write down what you called that lab, because that's a gem. Can you put that in the chat? Because I don't think Chris Nichols is here. He's tomorrow, isn't he? I reckon we should make a bid for that one. That sounds great. Another question that's come through from the audience, which is a gem, is around understanding that idea of collective intelligence and how the various disciplines and the different types of knowledge once sort of recognized, I guess, in the bureaucratic environment, can come together and work together. There's this question around how do you hold it accountable? Because the great beauty of the command center, right, is that you've got all that power concentrated. There's someone to blame, there's someone to change, there's the next party to roll in. But the collective intelligence has a much more shared and dispersed level of accountability. So how do you see that? How is that kind of ideally managed or dealt with in that model?
Well, let me attempt two answers to it. So one is within the national government or the region or province. To my mind, the easy answer is you actually stick with your traditional accountability rules. You have elected governments, you have ministers who are accountable for decisions. But in the run-up to decisions, you mobilize 101 different kinds of collective intelligence to provide you with new options, new insights, new ideas, new data, rather than just relying on the previous methods. the decision still lies with authorized authority. And then after the decision is taken, you also mobilize collective intelligence to scrutinize, learn, etc. So I think all of these methods are entirely compatible with, in some ways, quite traditional notions of state authority, but there are ways of making it smarter. The other issue is one we haven't touched on, but I've just written a piece on it, which is about global government. And one of the really interesting things happening in global governance, which has been very weak through this crisis, with the WHO under attack from Trump and so on, is actually the spread of organizations which are really only about collective intelligence globally. So IPCC on climate change, it bears on biodiversity, IUCN on conservation. We've got all these bodies now operating in very networked ways, organizing knowledge and information and evidence and so on, with no formal authority at all. That still lies with the ministers, but in a sense, the premise is that they create a different environment for decision making, which is more likely to be smart. Now, I happen to think we also need more classic state-like power at a global level to deal with all sorts of things. But it's fascinating to see how governance has gone a long way mobilizing collective intelligence tools, because perhaps of the big powers, US and China, sticking to traditional military force and finances they preserve. Global governance has had to almost go around those with these much more networked brain-like models.
Aaron, do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, just a quick one. I mean, Geoff is the expert on collective intelligence here, but the one thing I've always wondered is, how do we define what is the relevant collective that needs to be intelligent? There are certain instances where the collective might be a family, right? Or it might be a village or a town or something much larger, a province, a country, a global entity, as Geoff just pointed out. And I think one thing we need to do is be really quite rigorous for asking ourselves when these different levels of polycentric authority are actually most relevant, because there may be instances actually where the community that it needs to be intelligent is not that large. And in those cases, we want to give it the space to actually exercise the intelligence it needs to do, and potentially even the collective monitoring and enforcement. I'm a huge fan of Elinor Ostrom's work on the commons, right? Precisely because what she tells us is that there are certain types of resources like forests or fisheries where actually the direction of a Leviathan-like state or the free movement of market forces is insufficient and even inadequate to those situations. What you need is communal management based on norms and social capital and collective trust. And that isn't always transposed easily to other types of situations, but I guess having the discernment to know when those are relevant could actually be very powerful for us.
Absolutely, and it's striking how much those are needed in a crisis situation or to deal with the crisis that we have upon us, and what the kind of lead time there is to create the fluency and the capabilities that are required to actually make that happen when it's most needed or when the window opens for it. There's a question that's come through from Martin around this, that what we're talking about is these are skills and capabilities that you can learn and practice, that, to your point, they actually need to be embedded in advance, and they need to be part of our capability in terms of how public servants and public sector work together. How do you see the role of leaders in terms of making sure the curriculum in this space is developed and made accessible? I think, which is a particularly fascinating question, given even the word curriculum creates this sort of expectation of a standardized approach that can be rolled out, that's so at odds with a lot of the learning that we're finding at the moment. Geoff, over to you. I'm just alternating now. Go for it.
Yeah, well, a curriculum may well be the wrong language, but there are some things you would like leaders to know, you would like mayors to know, or ministers, or civil servants. And some of those actually relate to Aaron's question. So I think it's a whole set of new skills about how do you mobilize different kinds of intelligence for different tasks. And it may be data or insight or ideas, and there'll be different answers in different contexts. And often the right answer will be quite small numbers of people. More is usually not actually better in collective intelligence. Often it's better to have a small group who've really thought deeply about something than a whole load of people just mouthing off opinions on Twitter. And if there's one lesson, it's that. I think we need our leaders as well to have a sense of complexity and systems and how things knock on, and a pandemic is actually a great learning exercise, how a health problem becomes an economic one, becomes a social one, becomes a political legitimation problem. This is a pure, pure system story unfolding in front of us, which requires them to think horizontally as well as vertically in terms of government structures. But as you say, Sam, these things are not learned just by sitting in a classroom. You only really learn them by living them, by trying them out, by embodied learning by doing. And that's the kind of academy we almost need for the world's governments and leaders, which sadly doesn't exist. And most of the universities, I think, are still teaching a very anachronistic model. So I actually did my undergraduate degree at Oxford was in what's called politics, philosophy and economics, which our Prime Minister also did. It was invented a century ago when it was actually quite progressive, but it's completely out of date now. It has nothing about science, nothing about pandemics, nothing about statistics. It's so clearly out of sync with the needs of today that's why I think it is sometimes useful to talk about curriculums.
Yeah, absolutely. And Aaron, I mean, in your situation, you're dealing with a much more receptive audience that has been working in this space or has been getting acclimatized to this kind of thinking for a lot longer, by the sounds of it, than some of our other governments. How have you done it? It's all you now.
Yeah, thank you. I should add, first of all, that Geoff, I did PPE as well. So we may not be doing very well on the cognitive diversity point here. Let's hope we at least get concentrations in different subjects. I just had a couple of points to mention here. I fully support what Geoff said about complexity thinking, first of all. I think that is critical and one of the most important vocabularies that all leaders need to have. Even if they don't like the stuff, they need to read it and understand it and not get in the way when we need some amount of understanding of interdependencies and phase transitions and tipping points. All of that we really require, I think, in systems. I would add that some amount of understanding of futures and foresight as a method and a disciplined way of thinking is important. So using plausible stories about the future as ways of stress testing our assumptions about the present. Not making predictions, not about whether you get those right or not, but really examining yourself today in the safe space of 20 years from now and asking if we would respond well. So many futures reports and studies have mentioned the possibility of a pandemic, and yet we've not really been well prepared for it globally. I think that already in itself is quite telling. Third thing I would mention is polarity thinking. I think that is critical for leaders to not think in terms that are all about shopping lists and simple situations that don't require trade-offs. I think we are dealing with dilemmas or trilemmas even, or quadrilemmas maybe, where we just cannot have everything. And actually we need over time to balance and navigate across these different tensions and polarities. I think the amount of understanding that life is about the and or of a polarity rather than the no but of a binary is quite critical. And then the last one is, I think, the importance of deliberative and conversational techniques rather than purely rational ones. Rational techniques assume that there is a right answer about which, if I know it, I can persuade anyone else. But sometimes with complex problems, what we actually need is to all sit down, bring the different parts of the elephant that we're all dealing with, and then collectively come to an emergent outcome. I think the great theorists of deliberative democracy understood that, right? To see that there was a value in coming together and talking that would not happen if we simply did things by ourselves. And the talking can be done via Zoom, right? It doesn't have to be in person. Yeah. But that sense of the emergence from deliberation is critical. And I don't think all of us understand it fully.
No, that's certainly my experience. We are coming extremely close to time here, but I do have a last question that I would like to put to you both. It's a polarity one. So I'm going to ask you, Aaron, COVID, homeostatic or transformative? Which way do you think we're going to go?
I hope that it will be transformative. And I'm seeing incipient signs that it is, that give me a lot of hope, partly because people have been shocked out of their old homeostatic assumptions. But I don't want to be complacent about it. I don't want to assume that that's going to happen. So I think that those of us who believe in the importance of transformative equilibria must keep pushing for why that has to happen. Otherwise, the lazy assumptions from before will come back, and it'll be very easy for us to fall into the trap of homeostasis. but I'm
Absolutely. Shared accountability.
Yep.
Geoff, homeostatic, transformative?
I agree with Aaron's take. I think it's very hard to tell. All the instincts will be to be homeostatic, and all the pressures and the interest groups will be pushing that way, and it will require, you know, leadership and pressure from the sort of people on this call to use the crisis creatively.
That's exactly right. Thank you so much to both of you. This has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I would love to have much more time. And I've just found out that, in fact, we can have more time with Aaron, particularly at the festival event on how Singapore thinks next week. Sorry, how Singapore learns next week.
Yes.
And also will be thinking and learning. Fantastic discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you very much to the team at States of Change who are working so hard to pull all of this together across all the crazy time zones. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, the audience. Great discussion. See ya.
Okay.